The stagecoach's front wheel caught a smoke-blinded rut on the ghost horse switchback and flipped the whole rig onto its side before the driver could even shout a warning, and Jasper Monroe was already running down the slope before the dust settled. He had been 300 feet above the road, following a game trail toward a missing hunting party out of Draywood, when the sound reached him. Wood cracking, horses screaming, a woman's voice cutting through the smoke-thick air with more command than panic. He did not stop to think about the missing hunters. He dropped his rifle strap over his shoulder and went down the mountainside in long, reckless strides, boots skidding on loose shale, one hand catching branches to slow himself just enough to keep from breaking his own neck. By the time he reached the road, the coach lay on its side like a beached animal, one wheel still spinning lazily in the haze. The four-horse team was tangled in its traces, rearing and screaming against the smoke drifting down from the ridge fires to the west. A boy of maybe 16 was pinned beneath a broken axle rail, cursing through his teeth rather than crying, and a girl no older than 14 was trying to drag him free with hands too small for the task. And in the middle of it, half climbing out of the overturned door, was a woman with dark red hair escaping its pins, a torn sleeve and a knife already in her hand. "Get back," Jasper said, dropping beside the boy. "I've got him." "I do not need telling twice," the woman snapped, but she did not get back. She went to the horses instead, moving along the tangled harness with the knife flashing, cutting leather where it had cinched too tight, murmuring low words to the lead mare that had nothing frightened in them at all. Jasper set his shoulder under the axle rail and heaved. Wood groaned, iron shrieked, and the rail came up just enough for the boy to wriggle free, cursing again, one leg bent wrong at the ankle. "Tobias," the woman called, not turning from the horses. "Are you whole?" "Ankle's busted, Jennie, otherwise I'm grand," the boy called back, sounding almost proud of it. Jasper looked up at the woman properly for the first time. She had gone still at the head of the lead horse, one hand flat against its cheek, and she was staring at him the way a person stares at a bear that has wandered into camp uninvited, wary, assessing, unwilling to run. "You came down that slope like the mountain sent you," she said. "Heard the crash." He nodded at the boy. "He needs a splint before we move him. You always carry a knife handy as that." "I have carried a knife handier than that since I was 6 years old," she said, and went back to freeing the second horse. The driver, an older man named Purdy who ran the route between Draywood and the settlements along the Kestrel Road, had been thrown clear and lay groaning with a gash across his scalp, more frightened than hurt. Jasper checked him quickly, decided he could wait, and turned his attention to splinting the boy's ankle with 2 lengths of broken axle wood and strips torn from his own shirt hem. The girl, who he learned was named Nora, held the boy's leg steady without being asked, her face pale but her hands sure. "You've done this before," Jasper said to her. "Our brother, well, our people, we lose enough stock to broken legs that a body learns," Nora said. "Daniel taught us, before." The word "before" hung there, and Jasper did not push at it. He had learned long ago that grief announced itself when it was ready and not before. By the time he had the horses fully freed and calmed, the smoke had thickened enough that he could taste ash on the back of his tongue. Fire season had come early and mean this year, burning somewhere up in the high timber past Ghost Horse Pass, and the wind was doing what wind always did in that country, which was whatever it pleased. "We cannot sit here," the woman said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "That wind is coming down canyon, not up it. If it shifts again, we will be caught between the road and the burn." "You know fire weather," Jasper said, more statement than question. "I have farmed 3 summers in this territory. I know fire weather the way I know my own name." She looked at him directly then, green eyes steady in a soot-smudged face. "I am obliged to you for the boy. My name is Jennie Holloway." Jasper Monroe. He touched the brim of his hat, an old habit that felt suddenly clumsy under her gaze. "Sentinel post is 2 miles down. I can carry your boy on my horse, and Purdy's team can pull the coach once we've righted it, if we set our shoulders to it together." She measured him again, this time not like a bear in camp, but like a length of rope she was deciding whether to trust with a heavy load. "Together then," she said, and put her own shoulder to the coach frame without waiting for him to offer. It took the better part of an hour, working side by side in the gathering smoke, to get the coach upright and the team reharnessed. Jasper found himself watching her more than the task strictly required. The economical way she moved, no wasted motion, no complaint despite a forearm that was already purpling with bruise. When the coach finally groaned back onto its wheels, she let out a short, fierce laugh of triumph that startled him more than the crash had. "You laugh at wrecked coaches," he said. "I laugh at the coach not winning," she said. "There is a difference." They rode down to Sentinel Post with Tobias braced across Jasper's saddle in front of him, and Nora riding with the shaken driver. Jennie walking alongside leading the spare horse, refusing every offer of a seat until her legs simply would not carry her another quarter-mile, at which point she accepted his hand up behind him without a word of thanks, only a small, private exhale that told him more than words would have. The trading post at Sentinel sat where the Kestrel Road crossed Larkspur Creek, a low log building with a wide porch, run by a heavy-set, kind-eyed man named Otis Prout, who came out at the sound of hooves, already reaching for bandages before he'd finished asking what happened. Word of the wreck spread through the handful of buildings fast, the way word always did in small places, and by full dark half the post's regulars had gathered to hear it told twice over. It was there, sitting on the porch step with a cup of Prout's bitter coffee and watching Jennie Holloway argue calmly with the post doctor about how tightly her cousin's splint ought to be bound, that Jasper Monroe first understood he had not simply happened upon a wreck that afternoon. He had happened upon something that was going to matter to him, whether he had asked for it or not. Prout settled beside him with his own cup, following his gaze. "That there is Widow Holloway," he said. "Buried her husband Daniel this past winter. Fell through river ice checking his trapline, poor devil, dead before anyone found him. Left her with his place up Larkspur Creek and his young brother and sister to raise besides. She's raising them alone. Alone and stubborn as a Missouri mule about it," Prout said, not unkindly. "Turned down 2 offers of help already this season, one from the Ashfords who wanted to buy her out, one from that land agent, Cordray, who wanted considerably more than her land." He glanced sideways. "You planning on making a 3rd offer, Monroe?" Jasper did not answer that, mostly because he did not yet know what he would have said. The next morning, before the smoke haze had fully lifted off the valley, he found himself riding not toward the missing hunters he'd been tracking, but up along Larkspur Creek instead, telling himself it was only good sense to check that the Holloway coach horses hadn't taken lasting harm from the wreck. He told himself a number of things that summer that were not entirely true. The Holloway homestead sat in a good bend of the creek below a stand of lodgepole pine, a modest cabin, a barn built better than the house, and a garden gone half wild with squash vines that had outrun their rows. Jasper saw the place before he saw her, and he saw the hide rack before he saw either. There were 4 fresh deer hides stretched on the frame, and a 5th half-fleshed elk hide draped over a sawhorse, and Jennie Holloway stood over it with a bone scraper in both hands, hauling it down the hide's length with the kind of grim, repeating effort that told him she had been at it since first light and would still be at it come dark. Her hair had come fully loose from its pins now, sweat darkened at the temples, and there was a rawness to her knuckles that spoke of days of this work, not hours. She did not hear him ride up over the creek's noise, and he sat his horse a moment longer than he needed to, simply watching. There was something in the set of her shoulders, some refusal to yield to the weight of the work, that struck him harder than her sharp tongue had the day before. Nora came around the corner of the barn first, saw him, and called out, "It's the mountain man, Jennie," with such open delight that Jennie startled and turned, scraper still in hand, ready for trouble before she recognized him. "Mr. Monroe," she said, and something in her voice sat between wariness and relief. "Have you lost something up this way?" "Came to see how the coach horses fared," he said, dismounting, "and to see whether that boy's ankle is behaving." Tobias is on the porch complaining that he cannot help with chores, which suits him fine and suits none of the rest of us, she said. Her eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to the elk hide, and then back to him, and he saw the flicker of exhaustion she was working very hard to hide. "That's a big hide for one pair of hands," he said. "It is a hide the same size it has always been," she said, in a tone that told him plainly she had heard that particular observation before, from men who meant less kindly by it than he did. He let it lie. He checked the horses, found them sound, spoke a while with Tobias about the ankle, admired Nora's garden with enough genuine interest that the girl flushed with pleasure, and then, instead of riding on toward the hunting party he was supposedly tracking, he found a second bone scraper hanging on a nail by the barn door, picked it up, and went to the far end of the elk hide without a word. Jennie straightened up so fast her back audibly cracked. "What do you think you are doing?" "Scraping a hide," Jasper said, and set to it. "I did not ask for help." "No," he agreed, not slowing. "You didn't. I am perfectly capable. Never said otherwise." He glanced up at her, and something in his face must have been more gentle than his words, because the fight went out of her shoulders by a degree. Man can see a job's too big for one set of hands without deciding the hands are weak, Mrs. Holloway. I've fleshed enough hides in my life to know a lone woman working a full elk skin before frost is asking for a ruined back. And you have nothing better to do with your afternoon. "I have a hunting party gone missing somewhere past Ghost Horse Pass that I ought to be finding," he said. "They've been missing 4 days already. One more hour won't drown them." She watched him work a long moment, the scraper moving in the same steady rhythm his had settled into without him seeming to think about it at all, clearly a motion worn into muscle over years. Something in her expression shifted, not quite to warmth, but away from the guarded suspicion she'd greeted him with. "You have done this before," she said. "I lived 2 winters with a Blackfeet family when I was younger than your Tobias," he said. "A man does not eat that winter's meat without learning to work its hide. My hands know this better than most anything else I know." "Your Blackfeet family taught you," she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, testing. "Taught me the parts of living that mattered," he said simply. "I owe them for more than a hide-scraping trick." They worked without speaking for a while after that, the only sounds the scrape of bone against skin, the creek running low over its stones, Nora singing something tuneless in the garden. When they finally turned the hide and started the graining, Jennie worked her side without further argument, though every so often she glanced at him sideways as if still deciding whether to be grateful or affronted. "You're doing it wrong," she said eventually, nodding at his stroke. "I've fleshed 100 hides this way." "You've fleshed 100 hides the wrong way then, and simply never had a hide tell you so." There was a dry humor under it now, and he found himself grinning before he could stop it. "You are pulling too much toward yourself. Pull along the grain, not against it, or you will tear the hide at the shoulder." He adjusted his stroke. The hide, indeed, gave more cleanly. "Huh," he said. "Huh," she agreed, satisfied. And for the first time that day, something like a real smile crossed her face, quick and unguarded before she remembered herself and smoothed it away. By the time the light slanted long and gold through the smoke haze, they had finished the elk hide and started on the smallest of the deer skins, and Jennie's exhaustion had eased into something more companionable, the tiredness of shared labor rather than lonely burden. She brought him a cup of well water and stood a moment in the yard, looking at the 4 finished hides and the one nearly done. "I would have been at this until the next full moon working alone," she admitted, quiet, as if the admission cost her something. "You'd have gotten there," Jasper said, "just meaner and sorer than you needed to be. Why did you truly come back today, Mr. Monroe?" He considered lying, or half-lying, telling her again about the horses. Instead he looked at the hide rack, at the smoke-dimmed sun sitting low over the ridgeline, at her standing there with her sleeves rolled and her hair a ruin and her chin lifted like she expected him to disappoint her. Couldn't stop thinking about you working that hide alone, he said. Figured my conscience would rest easier if I came and saw for myself whether you needed the help you'd never ask for. Color rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. That is either the kindest or the most presumptuous thing a man has said to me in a year. Might be both, he said. Might be, she agreed, and did not tell him to leave when he said he would come back the next day to finish the last hides with her, nor the day after that. Over the following 2 weeks, Jasper Monroe's visits to the Holloway homestead became a fixture of the late summer, though neither of them called it courting, not yet, not out loud. He came most afternoons, after whatever tracking work occupied his mornings, and fell into the rhythm of her chores as naturally as if he had always belonged there. Splitting wood, mending a sagging fence rail, working alongside her at the hide rack, until the last of the summer's take was smoked and softened and folded away for winter trade. He found the missing hunting party on the 9th day. 3 green Easterners who had wandered off their marked trail chasing an elk and gotten themselves turned around in a smoke-confused canyon, cold and hungry but alive. And the grateful reward money from their families went, in no small part, toward a length of good wool cloth he left on Jennie's porch without explanation, knowing she would refuse it outright if he tried to hand it to her directly. She found it that evening and confronted him about it the next day with the cloth folded neatly under one arm like evidence in a trial. "I do not accept charity, Mr. Monroe. Wasn't charity, was payment. For what labor precisely?" "For teaching a fool mountain man to scrape a hide along the grain," he said, entirely straight-faced, and watched her fight a losing battle against her own smile. "That is the worst excuse I have ever heard." "Might be. Keep the cloth anyway. Nora's about grown out of that dress she's wearing and you know it." That argument, like most of their arguments that summer, ended not in victory for either side but in something softer, a kind of truce that left them both a little closer than they'd started. In the evenings, when the children had gone to bed and the smoke-dimmed stars came out thin and orange over the ridge, Jasper often stayed past sundown, sharing a fire and a pot of coffee on the porch step, and it was there that the harder truths of both their lives began to surface. "I had a wife once," he told her one such evening, staring into the fire rather than at her. "Long time back now. Before I came west properly. Fever took her the second winter we were married, back in Missouri. I came out here after, and I suppose I never much saw the point of putting down roots again after that. Roots just give the ground something to take from you." Jennie was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "Daniel and I came from County Clare," she said. "My family had nothing less than nothing, and his family had a little more but not enough to stay. We married partly for love and partly because 2 people crossing an ocean alone fare worse than 2 people crossing together. I did come to love him proper in time. He was a decent man, steady. He believed in doing right even when doing right cost him." Her mouth tightened. "It cost him plenty in the end, though not in the way you'd think." "How do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing toward the dark shape of the barn as if weighing how much to say. "There is trouble coming to this valley, Mr. Monroe, bigger than fire season. Daniel knew of it before he died. I do not fully understand all of it myself, only enough to be frightened." "Tell me," he said, and something in the quiet steadiness of it made her decide to. 4 years back, before we ever came to this valley, there was an agreement made between the government men and the Blackfeet bands whose hunting grounds run along Ghost Horse Pass, about where the boundary of settlement would sit and where their land would remain protected. Daniel was hired as a second translator for the signing, alongside the government's man, a fellow named Emmett Cordray, because Daniel had picked up some of the language trading furs before we ever settled here, and the Indian agent wanted an independent voice to confirm Cordray's translation was honest. Jasper went very still. "Cordray," he repeated. "Fellow who tried to buy your land." "The same." Daniel told me more than once that the words Cordray spoke aloud to the Blackfeet elders that day, and the words written down afterward in the government's copy, did not match what Daniel himself understood of the tongue. He raised it quietly with the agent at the time and was told to mind his place, that Cordray was the appointed interpreter and Daniel merely a trapper's assistant. Daniel let it lie for a time because he was young and unsure of his own understanding and had no proof beyond his own ear. But he kept his own written account of it in his own hand in case it should ever matter. Her voice thinned. He believed near the end that it mattered a great deal. He meant to bring his account before the territorial agent this fall. He never got the chance. "Where is that account now?" "Locked in his trunk in the loft," Jennie said. "I have not known what to do with it. I am a widow with 2 children to raise and a claim of my own to defend, Mr. Monroe. I cannot fight the government and Emmett Cordray besides." Jasper looked out at the dark tree line, thinking of the standoffs he had heard whispered of at the post, ranchers driving cattle onto grazing land. The Blackfeet band, under a leader named Standing Wolf, insisted the treaty had reserved for them, and the band's young men growing angrier by the week as their elders' patience wore thin. He thought of 2 winters spent in a lodge that had saved his life, of a debt he had never found a way to repay. "You won't fight it alone," he said. "Not while I'm drawing breath in this valley." She looked at him a long moment in the firelight, something guarded finally cracking open in her face. "You make it sound simple." "Isn't simple," he admitted, "but you don't have to carry it alone. That's a different thing than simple." She did not answer that night, only reached over and took his hand where it rested on the porch step, held it a moment, and let it go before either of them had to decide what the gesture meant. The trouble Jennie feared did not wait long to show its face. 10 days later, word came down to Sentinel Post that the Ashford Ranch had pushed a herd of 200 head up through the low meadow at the mouth of Ghost Horse Pass. Land Standing Wolf's people had grazed their own horses on every summer within living memory, land they believed the old agreement protected. Jasper rode up with Prout and 2 other men from the post the moment word arrived, arriving at the meadow to find young men from Standing Wolf's band drawn up on one side of the creek and Ashford's cowhands drawn up on the other. Rifles not yet raised, but hands resting close enough to stocks that the air itself seemed to hum with the danger of it. Emmett Cordray sat his horse near the Ashford men, well dressed for open country, watching the standoff with an expression Jasper did not like at all, something almost satisfied beneath the show of concern. "Mr. Cordray," Jasper called, riding forward slow with both hands visible. "This is your treaty boundary in dispute. Might be time you told both sides plainly what it says, instead of standing back watching them ready to kill each other over it." "I have told them plainly, Monroe," Cordray said smoothly. "The treaty grants the grazing rights below the pass to settlement use. Ashford is well within his lawful boundary." "That is not what my husband recorded," came a voice from behind, and every head turned as Jennie Holloway rode into the meadow astride her own mare, her chin high, a worn leather-bound journal clutched in one hand. Jasper's heart lurched with fear for her even as pride swelled hot behind it. "Widow Holloway," Cordray said, a thin edge entering his voice now. "This is no place for you. This was my husband's business before it was yours to twist, Mr. Cordray, and I will not sit at home sewing while men prepare to shoot each other over his good name." She held up the journal. Daniel Holloway wrote in his own hand the words spoken that day, and they do not match the boundary you have drawn. He wrote that the grazing land below the pass, this very meadow, was to remain in the Blackfeet band's use through every season but winter, in exchange for safe passage rights along the Kestrel Road for settlers. That is what was spoken. That is what was agreed. Standing Wolf, a broad-shouldered man with gray threading his dark braids, rode forward a few paces, his eyes moving between Jennie and Cordray with sharp attention. He spoke a few words in his own tongue to the young man beside him, who translated low. "He says the woman speaks what the old men remember was promised. He asks how she comes to hold this account. Because my husband did not trust the man standing beside your cattle drivers," Jennie said, meeting Standing Wolf's gaze directly, "and he was right not to." Cordray's composure cracked at last, a flush climbing his neck. This is the deranged grief of a widow clutching at her dead husband's scribbles. I am the appointed government interpreter of record, and my translation stands as the legal document. Then produce the original spoken record for comparison, Jasper said, his voice carrying flat and hard across the meadow. If your translation is honest, it will match my recollection of the tongue as well as it matches hers. I lived among Standing Wolf's people 2 winters. I know enough to hear a lie in the shape of it. Something flickered across Cordray's face, gone almost before Jasper caught it, but it was enough. Fear. This is not the place to settle a matter of territorial record, Cordray snapped. It belongs before the county judge in Draywood, not in a cattle pasture. Then let it go before the judge, Jasper said. Until it does, Ashford, you will pull your herd back off this meadow, and Standing Wolf's people will hold their ground without powder. Nobody dies today over a boundary line that might yet prove drawn in bad ink. It took another hour of tense, careful talk, Jasper moving between the 2 groups with the ease of a man fluent in more than one language of trust, before Ashford's foreman reluctantly agreed to withdraw the herd pending a hearing, and Standing Wolf's young men lowered the tension in their shoulders enough that rifles were finally set down rather than merely lowered. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a held breath rather than a fired shot, and that, Jasper knew, was as much as could be hoped for that day. Riding back down toward Sentinel Post afterward, Jennie fell in beside him, her hands still not quite steady on the reins. That was a fool thing to do, riding into the middle of that, Jasper said, though there was no real scold in it, only the aftershock of fear he hadn't let himself feel until now. It was the only thing to do, Jennie said. Daniel is not here to defend his own honesty, so I must do it for him, and it was the right thing, whatever the danger. You cannot fault me for doing right simply because it frightened you. I'm not faulting you, he said. I'm telling you it frightened me half to death watching you ride up alone, and I mean to say so plainly rather than swallow it. She glanced at him, something softening. That is fair, she allowed. I am sorry for the fright. I am not sorry for the doing. I wouldn't ask you to be, Jasper said, and meant it entirely. News of the confrontation reached Draywood within 2 days, and within a week a hearing date had been set before Judge Aldous Whitfield, to examine the disputed boundary language once and for all before the situation curdled into open violence. It should have been good news. Instead, 3 nights before Jasper meant to ride to the homestead and help Jennie prepare her husband's journal and testimony for the hearing, he arrived to find the barn door standing open and Nora in tears on the porch. Someone was here, she said, before he'd even dismounted. In the night. Jennie heard the dog barking and went out with the rifle, but whoever it was had already gone. They went through the loft trunk. Jasper's stomach dropped. He found Jennie inside, white-faced, sorting through scattered papers by lamplight. The journal, he said. Gone, she said, and her voice, for the first time since he'd known her, cracked. Someone took it. Everything else in the trunk is here, letters, Daniel's old ledgers, but the account of the treaty signing is gone. She looked up at him, and beneath the fear was a fury hot enough to burn. Cordray, we can't prove that, not yet. I don't need proof to know it in my bones. Bones won't hold up before Judge Whitfield, Jasper said, gentling his voice, kneeling beside her among the scattered papers. But we're not finished. You remember what was written in it. I know the tongue well enough to press Standing Wolf's elders for their own account of the spoken words that day. Direct testimony, to set against whatever paper Cordray produces. It will be harder without Daniel's own hand to show the judge, but it is not nothing. It is a great deal less than it was yesterday, Jennie said, but she let him take her hands, let herself lean into the solid warmth of him for the first time without pulling away out of pride, and Jasper felt something settle into place in his chest that had been unmoored since the day his wife had died, a rightness he had stopped believing he would ever feel again. The hearing was 11 days off. In that time, the summer's fire season, which had smoldered at the edges of the valley all season in the high timber, chose to remind everyone exactly how little any human quarrel mattered against it. It began, as such things often do, with wind. A dry southwest wind rose 2 days before the hearing, gusting hard enough to rattle the post shutters, and by the second evening the smoke haze that had sat gray and distant on the ridges for weeks had turned an angry orange, low and thick, carrying the acrid bite of green pine burning rather than the softer smell of old deadfall. Prout rode out himself to warn the outlying homesteads, and Jasper was at Sentinel Post trading news when the warning came for Larkspur Creek. He did not wait for Prout to organize a party. He was on his horse and riding hard before the older man had finished saddling his own mount. Cutting cross-country by trail, he knew better than anyone in the valley, praying the wind held its current direction long enough for him to reach the homestead before the fire crested the ridge above it. He arrived to find Jennie already working, calm in the face of chaos in a way that steadied his own racing heart even as it terrified him. She had the horses haltered and ready, Nora loading a wagon with what mattered most: bedding, food, Daniel's remaining papers, the tan hides folded and bundled, while Tobias, ankles still stiff but healed enough to bear weight, worked the water pump, filling every barrel and trough he could reach in a desperate, likely futile effort to wet down the cabin's shake roof. "Fire's coming over Sentinel Ridge," Jasper said, swinging down. "We've got maybe 40 minutes before it's on the meadow behind your barn, less if the wind gusts harder." "I know," Jennie said, not stopping her work. "I have eyes, Mr. Monroe, and a nose besides. Wagon won't make the main road in time. It's too choked with smoke, and there'll be others fleeing the same route. There's a cut down through Widow's Gulch, old game trail, steep, but it drops you clear to the creek ford below the burn line. That trail is barely wide enough for a horse. It's wide enough for a wagon if the wagon's driven by someone who trusts the man beside her," Jasper said, and something in the way he said it made her stop, look at him, and nod once, sharp and sure. They loaded the last of the essentials in a scramble of shouted instructions and shaking hands, Nora crying quietly as she carried out a small wooden box that had belonged to her and Tobias's mother, Tobias limping determinedly back and forth from the barn, with an armload of chickens he refused to abandon to the flames. The smoke had thickened enough by the time they set out that the sun overhead had gone the color of a blood orange, ash falling like grim snow across the yard. The trail down Widow's Gulch was every bit as narrow and treacherous as Jasper had warned, the wagon wheels inches from a drop on one side, low branches whipping at their faces on the other, the roar of the approaching fire audible now as a sound like a great and hungry wind even beneath the natural wind itself. Halfway down, one of the wagon's rear wheels struck a root buried under drifted needles, and the whole rig lurched violently, nearly pitching Nora from her perch atop the load. Jasper was off his horse, and at the wheel before the wagon fully stopped rocking, throwing his considerable strength against the frame to lever it back onto the trail, muscles standing out along his arms and shoulders as he heaved the loaded wagon clear of the root by main force, while Jennie held the terrified team steady with a low, unbroken stream of calming words. "Go," he shouted, once the wheel bit solid ground again. "Don't stop for me, I'll catch up." But it was Jennie who did not go, who instead threw the reins to Tobias and scrambled down beside Jasper as he worked a second, more stubborn snag free from beneath the wagon's undercarriage, smoke thick enough now to sting tears from both their eyes. "I told you to go," he shouted over the rising roar. "And I have never once done what a man told me simply for the telling," she shouted back, throwing her weight beside his against the stuck axle, and together the wagon lurched free at last, and they scrambled back aboard as the first burning embers began to land, hissing, in the dry grass around them. They broke from the gulch onto the creek ford with the fire's leading edge visible now on the ridge above the homestead, flames leaping 30 feet into smoke-black air, and Jasper felt a raw grief for the cabin and barn even as relief flooded him that every living soul and every horse, and even every chicken Tobias had refused to leave behind, was safe on this side of the water. They pushed on another mile to a wide gravel bar where the creek ran broad and shallow enough to serve as a fire break. And there, finally, they stopped, and Jennie Holloway climbed down from the wagon, looked back at the orange glow lighting the ridgeline where her home stood, and allowed herself, for the first time since Jasper had known her, to simply weep. He did not tell her not to. He simply gathered her in against his chest, solid and steady, and let her shake against him while Tobias and Nora huddled close on either side, and the four of them stood together on the gravel bar through the worst of the night, watching the fire crown the ridge, and mercifully, as the wind finally began to slacken toward midnight, begin to burn itself down rather than sweep further into the valley. By dawn, word came down the creek that the fire had indeed crested the ridge above Larkspur Creek and scorched the outer edge of the Holloway property, but a shift in the wind combined with a hasty fire break cut by Prout, and a dozen men from the post had spared the cabin and barn, though the hide rack and half the garden had burned to nothing. It was, everyone agreed, as fortunate an outcome as fire season had any right to offer. Standing at the edge of her blackened garden 2 days later, surveying the damage in the pale morning light, Jennie let out a breath that seemed to carry the whole summer's weight with it. "We will rebuild the rack," Jasper said, standing beside her. "Wood's cheap and I've built worse from less." "I know we will," she said. "I'm not grieving the rack, Mr. Monroe." She turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, something decided. "I have spent this whole season telling myself that needing help was a weakness I could not afford to show. You have spent it proving me wrong quietly, without ever once making me feel small for the needing." She reached up, brushed a streak of ash from his jaw with her thumb, and let her hand rest there a moment longer than the gesture required. "I do not know what to call what has grown up between us this summer. But I know I do not wish to face what remains of this fight or any fight after it without you standing beside me." "Jennie," he said, her given name feeling entirely new and entirely right in his mouth for the first time. "I have not felt at home anywhere in 11 years. I feel it standing in your burned garden. That has got to mean something." "It means," she said, "that you had better come inside and eat something, because a man cannot properly court a woman on an empty stomach, and I suspect that is precisely what you are attempting." He laughed, startled and delighted, and followed her inside, and it was there, over a simple meal of beans and the last of the summer's bread, that he finally leaned across the table and kissed her, slow and careful, as though she were something rare he had been searching the whole range for and had, at last, without quite meaning to, found. The hearing before Judge Whitfield could not wait for gardens to regrow or grief to fully settle. It convened in the Draywood Town Hall 6 days after the fire, the single largest room in the territorial seat packed to its log walls with ranchers, homesteaders, and a delegation of Blackfeet elders led by Standing Wolf, all crowded onto hard benches beneath a haze of pipe smoke and tension, thick enough to match the wildfire smoke still hanging faint over the valley outside. Emmett Cordray sat at a table near the front, composed and well-dressed as ever, a leather folio of papers before him that he touched now and again as though for reassurance. Jasper sat with Jennie and the children near the front on the opposite side, and beside them, looking uncomfortable in an unfamiliar borrowed coat, sat Otis Prout, called as a witness to the standoff at the meadow. Judge Whitfield, a spare, gray-whiskered man with a reputation for patience worn thin by territorial politics, called the hearing to order and invited Cordray to present the government's recorded translation of the boundary agreement. Cordray rose smoothly and read from his papers in a clear, confident voice, describing a boundary that placed the disputed meadow squarely within settlement grazing rights, the Blackfeet band's traditional use reduced to a narrow strip of poorer ground higher in the pass. "This is the official record," Cordray finished, "duly filed with the territorial Indian agent at the time of signing, 4 years past. And is there a witness to confirm this translation matches the words spoken aloud that day?" Judge Whitfield asked. The agent who oversaw the signing has since retired east, Your Honor, and is unavailable to testify, Cordray said smoothly. I stand as the sole surviving official party to the negotiation. Not the sole party, Jasper said, rising. Your Honor, my name is Jasper Monroe. I lived 2 winters among Standing Wolf's people some years past this signing and speak enough of their tongue to follow a conversation of consequence, though I was not present at the original agreement myself. I would ask the court's permission for Standing Wolf and his elders to give their own recollection of the words spoken that day, through a translator of the court's own choosing rather than Mr. Cordray. There was a stir through the room. Cordray's composure flickered, but he said nothing to object, perhaps calculating that a memory 4 years old, spoken by men the court might not fully trust, would carry less weight than his official paper. The court secured a translator from the nearby mission school, and Standing Wolf rose to speak, his voice unhurried and grave, describing in careful detail the words as he and the other elders present that day recalled them. A boundary line running along the ridge above the pass, the meadow and grazing lands below it reserved for the band's use through spring, summer, and fall settler passage guaranteed along the road in exchange. It matched, word for word in substance, what Jennie had read aloud from Daniel's journal in the meadow that day, the journal that had since vanished from her trunk in the night. This is the recollection of one party to a 2-sided agreement, Your Honor, Cordray said when Standing Wolf finished, his voice sharpening now with real strain beneath the smoothness. Memory fades and shifts to favor the rememberer. I have the official written record. Then perhaps the court should examine that official record closely, came a new voice from the back of the hall, and every head turned as Purdy, the coach driver from the wreck at Ghost Horse Pass, pushed his way forward, hat in hand, looking deeply uncomfortable at the attention but resolute nonetheless. Your Honor, I did not think this my business until Mr. Monroe here came asking around Draywood this past week whether anyone recalled Mr. Cordray's comings and goings around the time of the original signing. I have driven this route 11 years. I recall Mr. Cordray hiring a printer in Draywood, quiet-like, some weeks after the signing, to reproduce a fresh copy of the agreement papers, saying the original had been damaged by water. I thought nothing of it at the time. I have thought considerably more of it since. The printer, once summoned from his shop 2 streets over, proved reluctant but honest under the judge's pointed questioning, producing his own faded receipt book from 4 years past, which recorded payment from 1E. Cordray for the reproduction of a legal document, along with a note in the printer's own hand that Cordray had personally dictated several passages fresh, rather than simply copying an existing water-damaged original, a detail the printer had found odd enough at the time to record but not odd enough back then to question. This proves nothing beyond a reproduction of storm-damaged paper, Cordray said, though sweat had begun to show at his collar now. Then perhaps this will prove more, Your Honor, Jasper said and reached into his coat, drawing out a small, worn leather journal that made Jennie gasp aloud beside him. Daniel's journal, she whispered. Where? I have spent the better part of a week doing what I do best, Mrs. Holloway, Jasper said quietly, for her ears alone before raising his voice for the court. Your Honor, I am a tracker by trade, hired often when ordinary searching fails. When this journal disappeared from the Holloway homestead the night before the fire warning came through, I did not believe it had walked off on its own legs. I traced the path of whoever entered that home back through dry grass, still holding boot prints from the storm 2 nights prior, prints matching a particular gate, toward Draywood, toward a rented room above the mercantile that I have since learned is let to Mr. Cordray's hired man. I found the journal hidden beneath a floorboard in that room 3 days past, along with Mr. Cordray's own private notes, comparing his invented translation against Daniel Holloway's honest one, notes detailing precisely how far he could safely shift the boundary before either side grew suspicious enough to compare accounts. The room erupted into noise, Judge Whitfield's gavel cracking hard against his desk to restore order. Cordray had gone the color of ash, half rising from his chair before seeming to remember himself and sinking back down, all pretense of composure finally, thoroughly gone. "This document was stolen," he said weakly. "It cannot be entered as—" "It can be entered, Mr. Cordray, once its provenance and your own notes are examined by this court, which I intend to do at length," Judge Whitfield said, his voice gone hard and cold. "You will remain in this county until this matter is fully resolved, and I would strongly advise you consider what leniency remains available to a man who cooperates fully, because at present I am inclined to see you tried for fraud against both the government of this territory and the Blackfeet Nation, and I do not believe a jury in this county will look kindly on either offense." It took the remainder of that day and the whole of the next for the full truth to be laid bare. Cordray schemed to shift the boundary in both directions depending on his audience, telling settlers the tribe had been granted more than they had, stoking fear and resentment to drive down land prices along the disputed strip so that he might quietly purchase claims cheap from frightened homesteaders, including, it emerged under questioning, a fresh and considerably improved offer he had made to Jennie Holloway not 2 months past, an offer she had refused. He had told Standing Wolf's people a different lie again, claiming settlers had been granted rights the original agreement never intended, stoking their own justified anger, all of it in service of eventually controlling the water rights and grazing land at the mouth of Ghost Horse Pass for a cattle operation of his own, devising once both sides had exhausted themselves fighting each other over false lines. By the second evening, Judge Whitfield issued his ruling. The boundary would be restored precisely as Daniel Holloway had recorded it, and Standing Wolf's elders had confirmed. The meadow and lower grazing lands returned formally to the band's protected use. Settler passage rights along the Kestrel Road affirmed and guaranteed in writing this time, witnessed by both Standing Wolf and Judge Whitfield himself, with copies filed in triplicate to prevent any future tampering. Emmett Cordray was remanded for trial on charges of fraud, his land agent's license revoked on the spot, his hired man's testimony, once the man understood the weight of evidence against his employer, sealing the case beyond any reasonable doubt. Standing Wolf, before the assembly dispersed, crossed the hall to where Jennie stood with Jasper's arm steady around her shoulders, and spoke words that the mission translator rendered carefully. "He says," the translator relayed, "that your husband was an honest man in a season when honesty was rare, and that his people will remember the name Holloway with respect, not only Monroe. He says the dead of 2 winters is not forgotten either, and asks that you both come to his people's camp before the snow comes, to eat and to be welcomed properly as friends of the band, not merely as witnesses in a white man's courthouse." Jennie, blinking back tears she did not try very hard to hide, pressed her hand over her heart and inclined her head in the closest thing to the proper gesture she knew, and Standing Wolf's answering smile, brief and warm, told her she had done well enough. Outside the town hall afterward, the late summer evening had turned clear and cool for the first time in weeks, the wildfire smoke finally scoured from the sky by a clean wind out of the north, stars beginning to prick through a deepening blue that neither of them had seen unobscured in a month. Jasper found Jennie standing alone at the edge of the boardwalk, watching Tobias and Nora chase each other around a hitching post with the boundless relief of children who had spent a season afraid and were, at last, allowed to simply be young again. "Your husband would be proud of what became of his honest account," Jasper said, coming to stand beside her. "He would," Jennie agreed softly. "He believed doing right mattered even when no one was watching to reward it. I think in the end it did matter, though it took his death and half a summer's fire, and the stubbornness of a mountain man who could not stop himself scraping hides that were not his to raise the proof of it." She looked up at him, firelight from the town hall's windows warm on her face. "I owe you more than I know how to say, Jasper Monroe." "You don't owe me a thing," he said. I did what any decent man would do, seeing a woman working too hard alone. You did far more than any decent man would do, she said. You gave me half the work all summer long without once making me feel lesser for needing it given. You rode into a burning valley for me and mine. You tracked down a thief's hiding place and stood in a courthouse and spoke truth to power on my behalf, and standing wolves besides. That is not merely decency, Jasper. That is love, plain and unhidden, whether you have found the courage to name it yet or not. He looked at her a long moment, at the woman who had refused every offer of help all season until his had proven itself different, who had ridden into a standoff with a dead man's journal held high rather than let injustice stand unchallenged, who had wept only once briefly on a gravel bar in the worst night of her year, and then straightened her spine and kept walking forward regardless. "I love you, Jennie Holloway," he said simply, the words easier once he'd finally let them loose. "I have loved you since I watched you cut a horse free of its traces with a knife in one hand and no fear at all in your face, though I did not have a name for it then. I do not want to spend another season of my life tracking lost things through these mountains and coming home each night to an empty fire. I want to come home to you." "Then come home to me," Jennie said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, only the same steady certainty she brought to every decision that mattered. "Marry me, Jasper Monroe, and help me rebuild that hide rack properly this time, tall enough that we will not need to stoop over it come next summer." "That," he said, laughing, pulling her close under the clearing stars while Tobias whooped somewhere behind them and Nora laughed at her brother's antics, "is the finest proposal I have ever received in my life." "It is the only proposal you have received, I imagine. All the finer for it then." They were married 3 weeks later at Sentinel Post, a small gathering under a sky finally scrubbed clean of smoke, Otis Prout standing witness alongside a beaming Nora and a solemnly proud Tobias. And to the surprise and quiet delight of the whole valley, Standing Wolf himself arrived with several of his people bearing gifts of tanned buffalo robes finer than any Jennie had produced all summer, a gesture of friendship that spoke louder than any court ruling could. They rebuilt the homestead through the autumn, the cabin larger now with a second room added for the growing family it would one day hold, the hide rack rebuilt tall and sturdy exactly as Jennie had asked, and it became, in the years that followed, an unremarkable and beloved sight along Larkspur Creek. A mountain man and a farm widow turned wife, working side by side at whatever the season demanded, arguing cheerfully over the proper grain to pull a scraper along, laughing more than either had thought themselves capable of before that overturned stagecoach had thrown them together. By the following spring, when the first green came back thick and unafraid across the fire-scarred meadow below the pass, Jennie told Jasper quietly one evening, over the same porch step where they had first shared coffee and grief and the slow beginnings of trust, that she believed she was carrying his child. He did not say much in response, only gathered her against his chest the way he had on that terrible gravel bar the night the fire crowned the ridge, and held her there a long while beneath a sky finally, fully clear, thinking that a man who had spent 11 years believing roots only gave the ground something to take from him had, at last, found ground worth putting them down in after all.